edging closer and closer to your A-levels, not just your BT2, but your A-levels. So please make good use of your June holiday. All right? Whether or not you do well for A-level really depends on how you make use of your June holiday. So please, all right, make your June holidays as productive as possible. All right? Now we look at this question. So this question, at first glance, it may seem a bit too difficult for you. All right? But if you actually break the question down like what we always do, you will actually see that it's not that difficult after all. All right? So it's a 25-mark question here. This isn't the first time we do a 25-mark question. So as per usual, when we have a 25-mark question, what we tend to do is we always break the question down. All right? So for this question, we do the same thing. And you can see that for this question, there are several layers which we need to unpack before we can actually do. So first, we need to know what our command word here is, which is to assess. All right? So we are asked to assess importance of external stability, okay, in achieving an improvement of your standard of living for different economies. All right? So what do they mean by external stability? This is what we need to unpack, number one. What is external stability? When we talk about external stability, we also know that there's also the internal stability portion. So let us do a quick recap. Internal stability, what does it entail? What about the country? So what are we looking at? When we talk about internal stability, we relate it to your macro goals. Your macro goals. So internal stability here, we are referring to your sustainable economic growth. Inclusive is for Singapore's context. All right. What else? What else? The internal stability. We have your price stability. One more. BOP is internal. And your low unemployment. So these three, they are your internal stability. If you look at your lecture notes, I thought that was already made clear to you. If you look at your lecture notes, the first page of your lecture notes, every section, we have that diagram drawn for you. Internal, external. Internal, we are talking about these three: sustainable economic growth, price stability, and low unemployment. External, we are referring to favorable balance of payment position. All right. And once we have a favorable balance of payment position, we tend to also have a stable exchange rate. Okay? So for this question, we need to focus on your external stability. What does external stability here entail? All right? So how important is this? All right, in doing what? Next part is achieving improvement of your standard of living. Standard of living, by now, I hope you know that standard of living you need to also unpack into material and your non-material SOL. So material aspect, we are concerned about the amount of goods and services that can be consumed. Correct? You all know that, right? All right. Non-material, what are we concerned about? When we talk about non-material standard of living? Like? Sorry? Life expectancy being one of them. What else? Welfare in general. What kind of welfare? Educational attainment, health, leisure hours. All right. Your pollution level. Yeah. All right. So, material, we are looking at quantitative, the quantity of goods and services. Non-material, we're looking at qualitative, the quality of their life. All right, in terms of stress level, etc., those things that you all mentioned earlier. Okay, so this is second part that we need to unpack. Alright? And then the third part that we need to unpack here is this part here on different economies. What do they mean by different economies? What are the different type of economies we have out there? Alright? We have developed versus your developing. Developed versus developing. Alright? We have another one which is your size, small and open economies. And then also your large and less open. Yeah. Okay? Because question requires you to talk about different type of economies. Okay, at least talk about two. That means either developed, developing, if not small and open, large and less open. Alright, you talk about four, you tend to score higher lah. Alright, because you look at it as per what the question requires you to do. Alright, so this is the third part. Okay, so with all this in mind, you can see that it's not that difficult. You need to know the basic stuff. Alright, and then interpreting them and then organizing your answer accordingly as well. Any questions in terms of this question interpretation? No, ah? So, as per what we have always been doing, we look at our schematic plan. So this schematic plan will show you an outline of how you go about answering this question. Okay, and I highly encourage you to do the same thing during your exam so that you know how to organize your points. Alright, because sometimes when we mark, we see a lot of liquid paper, those correction tape all over. We know that you obviously never plan. That's why you have all these errors here and there. Otherwise, you won't have to make so many corrections or cancel, next page, that kind of thing. Alright, so if you actually plan, you'll be more organized in that sense. Alright, you don't believe, you try. Try during your holidays. Okay? So now we look, introduction. Introduction, like what we have done, we break everything down. So establish what external stability implies. About balance of payment, as well as your exchange rate. Impact on standard of living. Form possible comparison of different economies. So introduction, you talk about what you'll be looking at. So in your body paragraph, you want to talk about, when we talk about external stability, we're talking about favorable BOP position, right? So what is the opposite of external stability? Basically, we have unfavorable balance of payment position. So likelihood is we could have persistent trade deficits. Alright, persistent trade imbalances, currency volatility, how it could lead to a decrease in our standard of living. Then we want to talk about the benefits of stability and how it actually facilitates investment and sustainable growth, and therefore bring about your improvement of standard of living. So that's your so-called part A. Explain, ma? Correct or not? Part B would be you looking at, alright, for the different economies, how important is it? So assess the importance of it. Alright, so thesis will be importance, alright, to the different type of economies. To small and open economy, it is important. You look at Singapore as an example. Singapore, external stability is something that is crucial to us because of the nature of our economy. Our trade dependency as a percentage of GDP, how much is it? How much is our trade dependency as percentage of our GDP in Singapore? Trade dependency here, we are referring to exports plus your imports as percentage of GDP. Nikki, you have the answer? You look like you... How many percent? 70. 60. Export plus import as percentage of GDP.
Oh, it's like 300 or something.
400. 400%. Alright? Export roughly about close to 100 plus 200. Import also close to 100 plus 200. As percentage of our GDP. So if you add both of them up, that shows us the trade dependency. How dependent are we on trade? Singapore is about 400%. And because of this, external stability is crucial. All right, we will see how we explain that portion. Which part? What A and B? What do you mean by? In one whole answer, what do you mean by how I structure them? Put them together. I'm showing you how I break the question down. I mean, I'm showing this A and B because I show you usually A is explain, right? B is usually evaluate, discuss, assess, blah, blah, blah. So I'm showing you how, based on that one question, how we break it down into two parts that you need to answer, that you need to address. Because most of you tend to only answer the part B part. You don't answer the part A part, whereby you need to elaborate or explain something before you go into your answer. Okay? Can? To develop economies. Alright, why external stability is important, we will look at that as well. Alright, on the other hand, we will also see how external stability may not be that important for large economies. Large economy, if you go back, if you just flip through your question paper to CSQ1, you will see China, large economy there, right? How many percent, alright, of GDP is their trade dependence? If you add up. If you add up, roughly about? Yeah. Compared to Singapore, you see a huge contrast there, right? So for large economies, they tend to depend more on other components. China depended a lot more on investments, a lot more on the exports component. All right, but then they are trying to rebalance towards consumption here. USA, consumption, how many percent of their GDP? 70 is given in your extract 1 of your case study 1. You all need to remember all this. At least it helps you lah. All right, try to remember some of these figures. They are not that difficult. All right, US is about 70% on domestic consumption. India roughly about 55%. All these are stated there lah. All right. Okay, so with these numbers in mind, you can see that for these large economies, they don't really necessarily depend a lot on external stability, on their trade dependency because of the nature of their economy. So for them, maybe it's less important. All right, we will also see how for developing economies, it could also be less important. All right, and then on the flip side, we want to look at the whole thing. Does external stability necessarily improve your standard of living? Because if we look at external stability, it sometimes may not actually improve non-material as well, because of the impact on environment, impact on income inequality. All right, so these are areas that we will be dwelling into. All right, before we come with an overall conclusion and evaluation. Okay, any questions so far? You all need a break? Yes or no? Yes. Okay, so right now we will look at how we go about addressing the question. Okay, so like what I've done earlier, I shared with you internal stability, external stability, what they entail, what they mean. Alright, so we also talked about standard of living earlier. We talked about material, talked about non-material, and then the different economies out there. Okay? Okay, this part I've mentioned, I spent some time earlier, so I'm going to skip this part. Yeah. We look at small and open versus large and less open. That's one group. Developing. Because later you see how we will come out with different because based on their different characteristics, they will be impacted differently. Okay? So there could be overlap, but that would be something aside. Okay? Alright, now we look at the body paragraph. All right, how do we talk about this external stability? All right, whether is it important, whether it necessarily leads to increase in standard of living. So now we look at this external instability, how it leads to decrease in SOL. All right, so if we look at external instability, favorable, what is favorable BOP, Erica? When we talk about favorable BOP, what do we mean by favorable BOP? You have surplus? You avoid persistent deficit. All right, avoid persistent deficit. Okay, you would also want to avoid large surpluses. Why is that so? Why is it that we want to avoid large surpluses? Lead to inflation. Okay. Correct. Yes.
Is it the one about the exchange rate?
What about the exchange rate?
Value of currency.
Why? What about that? Is this beggar thy neighbor argument? Big beggar thy neighbor argument. So basically, if you have large surpluses, it means that other countries out there, they have deficits. So you think about in the long run, it's not going to be sustainable. Okay? So this is the beggar thy neighbor argument. You don't want your neighbor to become beggar. That's why it's called beggar thy neighbor. Really, I'm not lying to you. You go and Google. Beggar thy neighbor. You don't want to end up in a situation whereby your neighbors are begging you for stuff. Sorry? It's good for your country, but in the long run, you cannot always have that thing going on, because there could come a point in time, whereby they cannot afford to pay you back anything. Then what are you going to do? Huh? Yeah, it's one of the points that is in your lecture notes. If you go and look at the surplus portion. Uh-huh. Less price competitive lah. Okay. Alright. But really the huge concern coming out from these persistently large trade surpluses is not just this part about this argument. The argument here is also this one. So once they have higher purchasing power, it could lead to inflationary effect on the economy. Results overheating of the economy. Because this portion here, when you have surplus, right, it seems like it has an expansionary effect, blah, blah, blah. Your national income increase, positive economic growth, so on and so forth. But on the flip side, okay, it may go out of hand. It may become overheating. Overheating results, it will have negative implication on employment, income level, and standard of living. Okay? Alright, so you could talk about the surplus, you could also talk about the deficit. Deficit part, quite straightforward. You know that this will lead to fall in national income, reduced production, rise in unemployment, okay, and then lower material standard of living. Okay, so ideally, neither this nor that is actually good for the economy. So both are likely to result in negative impact, and hence standard of living. Okay? Okay, so next part, we mentioned about favorable BOP. We also talk about currency volatility. So we want our exchange rate to be stable. Because if it's volatile, moving up, moving down from time to time, it could result in certain problems. Alright, for example, if you have depreciation, could lead to cost-push inflationary pressures back home. Okay, resulting decrease in this, increase in COP, undermining the confidence of your foreign investors, leading to negative impact on economic growth, employment, income, and hence SOL. Appreciation, on the other hand, erodes your price competitiveness, negative impact on economic growth, and hence standard of living. Again, ideally, neither this nor that is actually preferred. Okay? So currency volatility is harmful to external trade and investment. Alright, because if you are a trader or investors, okay, you will be severely affected. For example, this Singapore exporter receiving payment in, let's say, US dollar, he could easily end up with unexpected losses due to adverse currency movement. So let's say exporter marked up the profit margin 10% in Sing dollar, a depreciation of the foreign currency profit, okay, by say 10% will have wiped out the entire profit. So he originally would have made a profit if it's in Sing dollar, if the trade was conducted in Sing dollar. But because of the fall in value of your US dollar, because let's say he collects his proceeds in US dollar, when he convert back to Sing dollar, let's say US dollar depreciated relative to Sing dollar by 10%, end up his profit would have been wiped out. So stability here in your exchange rate actually increases predictability, facilitates investment, resource allocation decisions, and therefore sustainable growth. Any questions so far? No? Alright, so external, yes.
Like in the news, right? It's not about. It's like I didn't link to SOL, but I only talk about, like, for example, for consumers, right?
You have to link to SOL for the purpose of this question.
In other questions, do we have to go so far when we talk about consumer stuff?
If it's just about consumer, households, or producers, firms, no need. But for this question, because they deliberately link it to SOL, you will need to make that attempt to link it back to SOL. Okay? Alright. Alright, next we look at external stability being important to small and open economy. So, Singapore, total trade to GDP ratio, 400%. Hence, down here, ensuring external stability is a major priority to protect economy from external shocks. So how do we ensure external stability? We do that through our modest and gradual appreciation of the Sing dollar. Alright, and when we do that, we actually achieve external stability, and this allows an increase in X minus M, FDI, and hence increases in AD, national income, employment, and material SOL. Alright, so you will see why small and open. We deliberately look at small and open. We don't just look at developed, developing. Okay? For large economy, like what we've mentioned earlier, US, 70% of GDP. Alright. Okay, so it helps them buffer, insulate from external shocks.
So, if we like quote this stat, right, it must look bigger.
What you mean?
Like the year that is calculated or something.
If you, by right, no need. Yeah. Okay. Hence, macroeconomic priority is to focus on stimulating domestic economy so as to raise their standard of living. So the relative importance of internal and external stability is determined by whether an economy is able to withstand external shock. This is evaluation. Alright, because just now we talk about open economy. We look at less open economy, small and large. Although there are economies that are more open than others, trade can potentially become a more important engine of growth for most economies. And hence, none can truly be totally immune from these external shocks. However, large economies are able to offset the impacts much better by rebalancing towards your domestic, your internal stability. So that's why for small economies, it tends to be more important to have external stability. For large economies, less so. Alright, because they can depend more on internal stability, more on domestic consumption. Okay? Any questions so far? No, then we will look at these developing countries argument. So most developed economies, they are faced with following trends. aging population. And then your production situated at the top of the supply chain, value chain, etc. So external stability here is important, as with an aging population, domestic demand will decline. So remember earlier we talked about how for large economies, less open economy, they can depend on domestic consumption. But you also need to be mindful about the demographic constraints. Alright, if the demographic constraint here is basically that of an aging population, then you also realize that, as time passes, consumption, domestic consumption as a percentage of GDP is likely to decline. Okay? And if that was the case, then maybe they should also consider rebalancing towards your external stability, because domestic consumption will become less significant an engine of growth. You may need to then shift back to your external, your trade. Alright? So external stability in terms of trade flows and exchange rate stability will help to ensure sustainable export-led growth, and hence increase in national income. And therefore your material standard of living. And then not just that, producers in developed economies, they are exposed to exchange rate risk, as most of their factor inputs or intermediate goods are imported. So exchange rate stability here will help to ensure less volatility there as well. Okay? Any question? So again, you need to look at the characteristic. Characteristic of developed economy is aging population. So if consumption is likely to fall because of this aging population, then you may want to consider, alright, focusing a bit more on your external stability to try to rebalance things away. Alright? How about developing economy? What's the characteristic like? A lot of people. What kind of products do they do? Developing economies, they tend to industrialize at the initial stages, industrialization. So industrialization also requires them to bring in a lot of capital goods, your machines. So a lot have to be imported. So they may have to accept some form of volatility. Singapore, for example, in our early days, 1960s, 1970s, if you go and look at our balance of payment, we imported a lot of machines. Because as we have MNCs coming in, as we welcome more FDI into our country, they will also want to bring their machines, their expertise over from their home country. So that is inevitable. And because of that, we are likely to have balance of payment deficits, because these are essential for the initial stages of development. Alright? So despite this volatility, alright, the increase here can actually result in our increase in standard of living, because as you have more capital goods, your potential growth increases. If you actually achieve potential growth, you have your LRAS increasing. Alright, and then your AD, national income, employment, material as well, all increase, because amount of goods and services that you can produce now increase as well. Alright?
But at this point, right, you're going to argue it the other way.
Which point? Which point are you referring?
External stability.
How do you argue the other way?
Because like it's still like you're going to argue it that way. Is it possible?
Or you because external stability here is referring to your favourable BOP, ma. So if you import a lot of your capital goods,
But aren't they like still developing?
so if you talk about developing, so you have to talk about the end product, lor. So developing economy is important, right? Because they export a lot of their goods and services. Because this one is talking about from the production point of view. Still can, but depend on how you frame it. Yes, that is possible. Okay? Can? Caitlin, you had a question also? Because you had your hands raised as well.
I'm going to ask you like, because current account includes the income balance, then if income inflow from other countries,
Is an inflow. So this part here is talking about inflow. All these are inflow. This is imported. So this one, they are actually inflow to your currency. So it actually plus. But this one will become minus because you're importing your capital goods. So the concern here is really this part, you see? Although this may be offset by your inflow of foreign aid and international loan, they have to be repaid eventually. So your loans that you take in, you have to pay back also. So for now it's inflow, but later on you have to pay back outwards. So that will be outflow.
Then why is it? Why do you consider it less important?
Because we have to accept this deficit for now. So that's why this favorable BOP would be less important a goal that we achieve. You get what? Yeah, that's what they're trying. Yeah. Correct. Okay. Alright, and then the last paragraph will be talking about how external stability here may not lead to improvement in non-material as well. Because if you look at China is this case example whereby we could talk about the negative externality with your pollution. Because as they industrialize, alright, as they gain external stability, etc., they have been exporting more than what they import, right? So their external stability is considerably to be favorable from their perspective. So over the past decade, okay, they have been focusing on growth driven by exports and FDI. Materially, it can be said that SOL has jumped significantly. Alright, but it's not uncommon for us to see China suffering from the effects of this, because you can see pollution. So non-material SOL, actually, they are suffering. Okay? Alright, and then focusing on external sources of growth may actually worsen the non-material as well, because it accentuates your income inequality. If you look at Singapore, you look at Hong Kong, alright, we have one of the highest Gini coefficient, as well as level of your social income inequality. And this has been largely because Singapore and Hong Kong, we have been dependent a lot on your trade component. We are trying to export. Alright, we also import quite a fair bit lah. Because when we import our raw materials but when we export our finished goods. In this process of trying to export goods and services outwards, we have this rush to try to make sure our exports are export competitive. Meaning that in terms of price, one of the lowest, one of the cheapest available out there. Not in terms of the quality of it. So inevitably, in our drive to chase after this cost competitiveness, we also go after cheaper, faster, better. We always go after your cheap foreign labor. And when we have cheap foreign labor, how did this impact Singapore? I think you know how it impacted Singapore. When we had cheap foreign labor, we opened our immigration doors. Alright, it led to inflow of a lot of your foreign workers coming in, resulting in social problems, social tensions between the locals and the foreigners. Alright, and then eventually the government had to close the floodgates. Alright, so this could actually lead to the depressing of your wages, which could worsen your income inequality problem. Hence, priority here is to focus on reducing income disparity through use of government transfers as well as taxes. Alright. So now we come to the last part, which is mini synthesis. So explain in thesis point 1, external stability may lead to long run increases in material SOL for small and open economies, but may be derailed by decreasing non-material SOL due to rising income inequality. Negative side effects of relying on external sources will have to be prevented or mitigated in order for us to really sustain this long run improvement in standard of living. So you can see that this is not so much of a conclusion, not so much of a summary, but more of an evaluative statement. Alright, and you need to do more than that, of course. In a globalized world, more and more countries step on external sources of growth, trade, FDI, inflow, etc. Invariably, their growth and hence SOL will be more vulnerable to external instability or shock. Therefore, it can be said that importance here will increase. However, external stability in itself does not ensure that fruits of growth are shared equitably. Alright? An improvement in SOL is only sustainable if governments are aware of the trade-offs made when deciding its growth strategy. between the different segments of the population and between material, non-material as well, and device policies to prevent or mitigate such negative side effects. Can? Yeah. Sorry? Then how? This is not just this section, this is the whole answer key. That's how you get 11,000 words. Trying to smoke but cannot smoke through, huh? Alright, any questions? If not, that will be the end.